Good afternoon, and welcome to our second lesson on Detente. So, Detente relates to an improvement in the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. It's closely associated with the US President Richard Nixon, who becomes president in 1969, and the Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev. Um, but before 1969, before Nixon becomes president, there are a number of improvements made in the relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States. So we don't refer to this as détente, but there are some early steps in an improved relationship. And these steps can be traced back to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. So out of the Cuban Missile Crisis and out of this fear that the world came close to destroying itself, we see in 1963 the nuclear test ban treaty, and we also see the installation of the hotline telephone link. In 1967, again, this is pre-détente, so Lyndon Johnson is the President of the United States, and he holds a meeting with the Soviet Premier Kosygin at Glassboro, which is in New Jersey. But détente really comes into being in 1969 when Richard Nixon is elected President of the United States. In that same year, we see the election of Nixon, committed to détente. We see Willy Brandt is elected as the West German Chancellor, and we see the beginnings of his Ostpolitik. We see the Azuri River dispute, this dispute between the United States and Soviet Union, so that rift begins to appear between those two, which opens the door for the triangular diplomacy of Richard Nixon. It's also the year that the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty talks begin. So other developments as we see them: 1970, Willy Brandt visits Moscow. They reach an agreement over Berlin, which is sort of ground zero of the Cold War in Europe. 1971, we see Henry Kissinger, who was Richard Nixon's Secretary of State, visit China, and the start of this rapprochement between the United States and China. 1971, we also see the Seabed Treaty, and then in 1972, we see one of the high points, which is Nixon's visit to China and the Shanghai Communique. The relationship between the United States and China plays an important part here, this so-called triangular diplomacy. What the United States are doing following the Azuri River dispute is they are sensing that there is an opportunity for them to really create an even bigger division between the world's two leading communist powers, China and the Soviet Union. So the rapprochement between the United States and China, it is designed to exert as much pressure on the Soviet Union as they possibly can and extract a better deal from them. So 1972 sees Nixon's visit to China and the Shanghai Communique. It also sees the basic treaty signed between East and West Germany. Both of those nations are admitted to the United Nations. And we also see the signing, the high point of détente, the signing of the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or the SALT Treaty. It's agreed at a Moscow summit between Nixon and Brezhnev, and included in the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, we have an interim treaty, we have the ABM Treaty, and we have the Basic Principles Agreement. So the core ideas then behind détente are that despite these profound differences between the capitalist and communist countries, war was not inevitable. There were mutual interests shared by the United States on one side and the Soviet Union and China on the other that could be best served by cooperation. And these are around what should happen in regional conflicts, about trade and investment, and in disarmament, and trying to do whatever they could to avoid war in the future. So if we look at why each side pursued this, firstly, why did the Soviet Union pursue détente? So firstly, they desperately wanted to reduce military expenditure. They wanted to invest in consumer products. Secondly, they hoped that some sort of accommodation with the West would help slow down technological advancements in nuclear missiles, of which the United States was starting to run away and really take a lead from the Soviet Union. And thirdly, there was a huge amount of concern about US-Chinese relationship, the Chinese-American relationship. They feared that that was possibly aimed at the Soviet Union, and therefore they sought greater accommodation with the West. And from a practical point of view, they also wanted to gain access to US grain exports and also technology transfers. So what we see with sort of Sino-US relations or Chinese-US relations is a significant improvement. Before Nixon was president, the United States didn't even diplomatically recognize the communists as being in charge of China. But over a couple of years, they do. Kissinger visits China. First of all, the Americans withdraw their support from Taiwan as the legitimate leaders or rulers of the government in exile that they claimed, the United States claimed was the legitimate government in China. They remove their support from those, and then we have the Shanghai Communique in 1972, where Nixon visits Mao in China. He goes to Beijing. That is part as a response to ping-pong diplomacy, where table tennis brought the United States and China together, and also a gift to Washington Zoo from the Chinese of 2 giant pandas. So you cannot underestimate the importance of relations between China and the United States in exerting pressure on the Soviet Union to do a deal. From the United States' perspective, they wanted to pursue a détente with the Soviet Union for a number of reasons. Firstly, they had realised that there were limitations to their power. They were involved in this conflict in Vietnam, which wasn't going as well as they felt that it would. It wasn't as easy victory like they felt it would. They were in an unwinnable situation, and they basically wanted out. And they felt that détente would help them with that. They also had economic issues. There was rising unemployment, there was high inflation, there was a high national debt, and they wanted to reduce spending on their military. There was a sense that their military spending had overstretched their spending domestically. So they decided to pursue détente for those reasons. The benefits of détente, it led to a reduction in tensions between the US and the Soviet Union, and there were a number of agreements which were reached. You know, the strategic arms limitation talks, which lead to the strategic arms limitation treaties between 1969 and 1972, where you have the basic agreement on non-confrontation, you have the seabed treaty, which says that the ocean floor will be kept free of nuclear weapons, and you have the ABM treaty, anti-ballistic missile treaty, which says that neither side will work on defensive shields. All helped to improve relations between the two of them.